I felt it as a click, sharp, metallic, and internal, right behind my sternum. I tore my shirt open, and there it was, a brass rimmed keyhole sitting directly over my heart. I hadn't just repaired the clock, I had become the spare part. I want to tell you about the last repair I ever took on. Not the last one I finished, the last one I took on, because those are two very different things. And by the end of this, you'll understand why. My name is Elias Thorn, and for 11 years, I ran a repair shop on the corner of Renfield and Ash in a town called Riverbend that most people drive through without ever noticing. I fixed watches, pocket watches, wrist watches, the occasional grandfather clock that some grieving family wanted ticking again before a funeral. It's quiet work, predictable work. You open the back, you find the broken part, you fix it, and you close it back up. 40 years of doing that to other people's timepieces, and I thought I understood the rules of my own small universe completely. Then a man came into my shop on a Tuesday evening in October, and he set a case on my counter that I still, to this day, wish I had refused to touch. He didn't give his name. He just said, "It stopped 100 years ago. I'd like it to start again," and left a card with no phone number on it, just an address that turns out, when I checked later, to belong to an empty lot. That should have been my first warning. I ignored it because business had been slow and because the case itself was beautiful. Dark leather, brass fittings gone soft with age, and a clasp that I had to work loose with my thumbnail. The moment I got the clasp open, before I'd even lifted the lid all the way, I felt it, a tremor, faint and irregular, running up through the leather into my fingers, the way a current runs through a wire you don't know was alive. I told myself it was my own pulse, my own hand shaking from the effort of prying the clasp loose. But my hand wasn't shaking. The case was. Inside, nestled in velvet the color of a healing bruise, sat something the tag called a perpetual chronometer, and it kept doing that same small, irregular tremor even after I'd set it flat on my counter. Not a vibration you'd get from a loose gear rattling around. Something with rhythm to it, something with intention, like a bird testing the bars of a cage it's only just noticed it's in. I lifted it out, and it was warm, not sun through a window warm, body warm. The kind of warm you feel when you shake someone's hand and realize a half a second too late that their skin is a few degrees hotter than yours should be comfortable with. And the glass face wasn't dusty, it was fogged, like a breath on a cold window, clearing and reforming every few seconds in the same slow, steady rhythm I'd felt through the leather. I stood there in my empty shop at closing time, holding a clock that trembled and breathed, and I told myself it was condensation and a draft and my own tired imagination. Told myself a lot of things that October that turned out to be lies I'd built myself out of convenience. The first incision, if you'll forgive me for calling it that, instead of what I called it at the time, which was opening the back plate, happened 3 nights later. I want to be clear that I am by nature a careful man, steady hands, 40 years of working with parts smaller than a grain of rice will do that to you. So when I tell you my hands shook when I removed those 4 brass screws, understand that this was not normal for me. This was my body knowing something before my mind caught up. The way you flinch from a hot stove a half a second before the pain actually registers. I expected the cold, familiar logic of brass teeth and hairsprings, the architecture of every clock I'd ever touched. What I found instead was a wet, silver labyrinth, valves, silver plated and slick, opening and closing in sequence, coated in a thin, translucent oil that smelled faintly of copper and something warmer underneath it, something almost like sweat after a long day's work. Threading between the valves, thin as embroidery floss, ran a network of what I can only describe as copper veins, pulsing in a rhythm close to a heartbeat, but not quite right, like a song played a half a step out of tune. I sat back on my stool and I did something I hadn't done in years. I laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain simply didn't have a folder to file this information into, and laughing was the only door it could find. My assistant, Marlowe, a lanky kid barely out of his 20s who I'd hired mostly because he was patient with difficult customers, poked his head in from the back room where he heard me. "You all right in here, boss?" he asked. I told him I was fine. I didn't tell him what was sitting open on my workbench. Here is the diagnosis I came to over the following week. I want you to sit with how insane this sounds, because I certainly did. The clock wasn't broken, it was starving. It needed a rhythm to imitate, something living to set its pace against, the way a lost hiker will follow any light into the dark, even if that light is leading them somewhere they shouldn't go. So I did the only thing that made sense to my sleep-deprived mind at 2 in the morning. I moved my chair next to the workbench, unbuttoned my shirt collar, and let the clock listen to my heart. The shop changed after that. I don't know a better word for it than changed. Sound stopped working the way it should. I'd drop a wrench and hear it hit the floor a half a second later than I expected, like the room itself had a slight delay built into it. Cars used to pass on Renfield Street all through the night, and I'd always found that noise comforting, proof that the rest of the world was still out there living its life. That noise disappeared, not faded, disappeared, the way a word vanishes from your memory mid-sentence and leaves you standing there with your mouth open and nothing coming out. It was around the 9th day that I noticed it wasn't just the street sounds. It was Marlowe, too. He'd come to the workbench to ask me something. I never even found out what, and I watched his mouth moving, forming words, his eyebrows raised in that expectant way they get when someone's waiting on an answer, and I heard nothing. Nothing but the clock's pulse, steady and enormous in my ears, filling up every space human speech used to occupy. I shook my head, tapped my own ear, and he seemed to understand because he grinned, tapped his ear right back at me, and mimed cranking an old hearing aid before wandering back toward the front counter, shaking his head at me the whole way. I didn't correct him. I sat there instead, watching his back through the doorway, and felt something I wasn't proud of: relief. The clock's rhythm was louder than the world now, and some new, unfamiliar part of me had started to prefer it that way. By the 11th night, the clock was beating in perfect time with my own pulse. I checked this obsessively, the way you check a bruise to see if it still hurts. Some part of you hoping it will, and another part of you hoping it won't. I'd press 2 fingers to my wrist and count, and the little copper valves would open and close in exact synchronization, beat for beat, like 2 singers who'd finally found the same key after a long, off-tune rehearsal. The keyhole didn't arrive gently. I want to correct something I believed for a long time, which is that horror creeps up on you slowly and gives you time to prepare. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it arrives all at once, mid-motion, while you're doing something as small and ordinary as winding a customer's pocket watch. I felt it as a click, sharp, metallic, and internal, somewhere behind my sternum, exactly in time with the turn of the winding key in my fingers, as if my own hand, turning that small brass key, had also been turning something inside my own chest. I dropped the customer's watch. I tore my shirt open at the collar hard enough to pop a button, and there it was. Small, brass-rimmed, a keyhole sitting directly over my heart, in skin that had been unbroken and ordinary my entire life. I understood all at once, with the kind of clarity that arrives exactly when you least want it to, that the client hadn't brought me a clock to repair. He'd brought me a spare part for something I never knew I was missing, and somewhere in the last 11 nights, without my permission, I had already started winding it. I'd like to tell you I ran, that I threw the chronometer back in its case, boarded up the shop, and drove until Riverbend was a memory in my rear view mirror. That's what a smart man would have done, and for most of my life I considered myself a smart man. But instead, I sat down at my workbench, and I kept working. Because some doors, once you've seen what's behind them, don't actually let you walk away. They only let you decide how to go through. Everything shifted for good. I fell asleep at the bench, which I'd done 100 times over the years. But I woke up somewhere else. It looked like a workshop in the loosest sense of that word, the way a nightmare looks like your childhood bedroom, right up until you notice the walls are breathing. Thousands of hearts hung from the ceiling on brass chains, each one ticking at its own private rhythm, swaying gently like fruit on some vast, impossible tree. Some beat fast and frantic. Some beat so slow I found myself holding my breath in sympathy, willing them along. A figure stood at the center of it all, tending to them the way I used to tend to my own shop, and I understood, without needing to be told, that this was the one who'd sent the client to my counter. Its skin had the texture and color of old parchment, creased and yellow at the joints. Where its eyes should have been, there were two watch faces instead. The hands rotating slowly, out of sync with each other, one running fast and one running slow, so that looking at its face felt like trying to read two different clocks arguing about what time it actually was. I was still taking all of this in, still trying to find some foothold of logic in a room built entirely without any, when my eyes landed on a heart 3 chains to my left, beating slow and heavy, and I recognized the little brass plate soldered near its top. I'd repaired that plate myself 2 years earlier for a woman named Constance Hale, who'd brought in her late husband's watch and asked me, almost apologetically, if there was any way to make it run again so she could hear it in the evenings. I remembered her hands shaking as she'd handed it to me. I remembered telling her it would be ready by Friday. It was ready by Friday. I'd never once wondered what happened to her after that, though. Standing in that room, I understood that this wasn't a workshop at all. It was a collection, and I was being invited to add myself to the shelf. "You keep it alive longer than most," the figure said, and its voice sounded like pages turning. "Most don't make it as far as you have. Most let it die of loneliness in a drawer somewhere, and we simply collect what's left over." I asked it in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt. What would happen if I wound the clock one final time? "Chronometer starts properly, permanently," it said, "and the part of you keeping your own heart company stops needing to." I understood, the way you understand the ending of a story you've already guessed the shape of. Winding it meant the perpetual chronometer would beat forever, vibrant and unbroken. A clock that would never again know what it was to starve. And it meant my own heart, the one that had been feeding it in secret for 11 nights, would simply hand off its job and rest. I stood in that room full of hanging hearts, all those small, ticking lives suspended above me, Constance Hale's husband's heart included, and I thought about how tired I actually was. Not tired like I needed sleep, tired the way you get after decades of quiet, careful, predictable work, fixing other people's broken things, while your own life sat closed up in a case nobody had opened in years. I reached for the key. The client came back to the shop on a Tuesday evening, same as the first time, like the whole thing had simply looped back around to where it started. The shop was empty. Marlowe's coat still hung by the door, though nobody had seen Marlowe in 3 days. And if that detail bothers you, it should, because it certainly bothers me to think about now. On the counter sat the Perpetual Chronometer, and it was no longer fogged or dim or waiting to be fed. It ticked loud and rich and full, louder than any clock had a right to tick, like it was finally, after 100 quiet years, allowed to be heard. And in the front window, where I used to display a few of my finer repair pieces to draw customers in off the street, there now stood a mannequin, new, well-dressed, posed mid-motion, like it had just turned to look out at the road. It looked remarkably like me, and where its eyes should have been, someone had fitted 2 small watch faces instead, their hands turning slow and patient, keeping their own private time behind the glass. The client picked up the chronometer, wound it once more out of habit, and tucked it back into its leather case, and then left the same way he'd come in. The bell over the door rang the way it always had, and the shop settled back into silence. Somewhere behind that window, keeping perfect, patient time, I imagine I'm still standing there, waiting for the next tick. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The way we spend our lives trying to fix what's broken, never realizing that some things are meant to be replaced. Elias Thorn was a careful man. Most of us are. We think we're the ones holding the tools, when really we're just waiting for the right hand to wind us. I wonder if you felt that first warmth on the glass, or saw those silver valves pulsing under the brass. Would you have walked away, or would you have sat down at that workbench, just like Elias, and waited for your own ticking to begin? Leave a comment below if you've ever felt like your own life was running on someone else's time. I read every one of your comments and stories. They keep the shadows here from getting too lonely. And if you aren't ready to leave the shop just yet, I've left another tale of a bargain gone wrong right here for you. Until the next tick, keep your eyes on the veil.